Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather as the tires of his SUV crunched over the gravel of a forgotten driveway in the deep woods of Alabama. The silence here wasn't the peaceful kind yet. It was the heavy, expectant sort that precedes a storm, mirroring the internal pressure he'd been carrying for months. He had left the city behind, the relentless pings of his inbox, the cold distance growing in his marriage, and a career that felt like it was swallowing his soul. As the engine cut out, the only sound remaining was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic call of a loon across the water. He was at his grandfather's cabin, a place that hadn't changed since the mid-20th century, and he was here because he was desperate. The wooden dock stretched out into the lake like a reaching hand, and the old rocking chair on the porch sat motionless, waiting for someone to occupy the space between the noise of the world and the whisper of the divine. For Ethan, this wasn't just a getaway, it was a final attempt to find the God he had lost somewhere between a promotion and a breakdown. He pushed open the heavy oak door, and the smell of cedar and old paper immediately rushed to meet him, a scent that carried the weight of decades. On the small table beside the fieldstone fireplace sat the object he had been avoiding, his grandfather's Bible. It was a rugged, leather-bound volume, the edges worn smooth by hands that had spent hours in study every morning at 4 a.m. His grandfather, a man of profound faith who had farmed 60 acres and preached in small Alabama communities, lived by a rhythm Ethan could no longer fathom. On that first night, the silence of the cabin felt like an indictment. Ethan sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the jagged tree line, turning the lake into a sheet of liquid copper. He remembered his grandfather's voice, resonant and clear, often saying that God whispers where the world is quiet. But as the shadows lengthened, Ethan realized that he had become so loud, his worries, his plans, his striving, that he couldn't hear anything else. Science tells us that solitude in the wilderness can actually lower cortisol and clear the neural pathways blocked by overstimulation, but for a man whose soul is parched, the quiet is initially a battlefield. He wasn't just fighting his schedule, he was fighting the illusion that he was the one keeping his entire world from falling apart. By the third day, the frantic rhythm of the city began to lose its grip. Ethan started rising with the sun, watching the mist roll off the water in ghost-like ribbons. He found himself back at that small table, finally opening the old Bible. As he turned the pages, a yellowed envelope slipped out and fluttered to the floor. It was a letter, penned in his grandfather's steady, looping script, addressed to whoever might one day find themselves seeking refuge in these walls. The letter spoke of the lake as a teacher, explaining that only when the water is perfectly still can it reflect the beauty of the sky above. The same, it claimed, was true of the human heart. "Slow down, my son," the letter urged. "Be still and let God remind you who you are." In the original Hebrew, that command from Psalm 46:10 to be still is the word rapha. It doesn't just mean to be quiet, it means to let go, to release your grip, to cease the striving. It is a radical instruction spoken not into a vacuum of peace, but into the middle of chaos, into a world where mountains are falling into the heart of the sea. Ethan realized that his grandfather hadn't found peace because his life was easy. He had found it because he knew how to surrender his control to the one who actually holds the world together. That evening, Ethan walked out to the very end of the wooden dock. The stars were beginning to pierce the velvet sky, reflecting perfectly in the glass-like surface of the lake. There was no wind, no hum of electricity, just the vastness of the cosmos and the stillness of the water. He sat there, his legs dangling over the edge, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to pray with a list of demands or a set of justifications. He simply breathed. He looked at the reflection of the stars in the water and understood the mechanics of his own restoration. In the New Testament, Jesus is often found withdrawing to desolate places to pray, moving away from the crowds to reconnect with the Father. He was the good shepherd who led his followers beside still waters, Mai Menachat, waters of rest that nourish the soul without the threat of the raging flood. Sitting there, Ethan felt the heavy armor of his self-reliance finally begin to crack. He whispered a surrender, handing over the broken pieces of his marriage and the crushing weight of his career. He wasn't escaping his problems, he was finally bringing them to the only source capable of carrying them. The peace that settled over him wasn't the removal of his challenges, but the sudden, unshakable awareness of a presence that had been waiting for him in the quiet all along. As the fire in the hearth flickered into embers on his final night, Ethan returned to that verse his grandfather had loved. Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." It's a verse we often use to soothe a minor headache, but in reality, it is a holy battle cry. It is a protest against the tyranny of the urgent and the lie that we are our own saviors. Theology suggests that this stillness is an act of waiting, a purposeful gaze upon the beauty of the Lord that transforms us from one degree of glory to another. When Ethan packed his bags the next morning, the problems in the city hadn't vanished. His marriage still needed work, and his job was still demanding. But he was different. He had found the living water that Jesus spoke of to the woman at the well, water that quenches the deepest thirst of the human condition. He stood on the porch one last time, looking at the lake, which was now a mirror for the morning light. He had come to the cabin to escape, but he was leaving with a clarity that only comes when the sediment of a busy life is allowed to settle. He knew now that the quiet wasn't something to fear, it was the altar where he could always find his way back to the heart of God. Our lives are often so cluttered with the noise of our own making that we forget the sound of the voice that called the world into being. But God is a shepherd who still knows the way to the quiet places. He still invites us to step away, to sit beside the still waters, and to remember that his peace is not a destination we reach, but a person we encounter. When the mountains of your life feel like they are shaking and the waters are roaring, remember the invitation of the cabin. Remember that surrender is the first step towards strength, and that in the stillness, you are never truly alone. Lord, when life becomes overwhelming, lead us beside still waters and restore our souls. Help us to slow down, listen for your voice, and find peace in your presence. Amen. Share this story with someone who needs to find their own quiet place today.